That suitcase is more worth taking along than he is." Then my father pulled the suitcase away right in the middle of the crowded airport preparing for a vacation trip and left his own father behind like something that had been thrown away. My grandfather sat on a waiting chair, his hands trembling. He had Alzheimer's. He looked confused, not understanding what was happening, only thinking that the whole family was getting ready to go on a trip together. It turns out greed can turn family into strangers and make cruelty feel normal. I stood there frozen when I saw them abandon my grandfather just for money. What about you? If you were in this story, what would you do? Before I continue this story, I truly want to know where you were listening to me from. Maybe in a quiet kitchen, your living room, or on the couch after a long day. Leave a comment and let me know. And if this story makes you think about your own family, please hit like and subscribe. Don't leave halfway through, because what happened after that was far more cruel. My name is Rachel Bennett, 29 years old, born and raised in a small town in northern Missouri. That morning, we arrived at the airport while the sky was still a dull gray. My father said this trip was to visit relatives out west, and my mother said a change of scenery would be good for my grandfather's health. My grandfather, Harold Bennett, walked a few steps behind us. An old gray sweater hung over his thin shoulders, and in his hands he held tightly to a worn transistor radio. That little thing had been with him for decades, back from the days when he drove trucks across states. His memory now faded in and out. Some days he even confused my name, but that radio always stayed exactly where it belonged in his hands, like a priceless piece of memory. My father was at the check-in counter while my mother opened her wallet to look for documents. I glanced at the tickets she was holding. 4 sheets of paper, neatly stacked. I read each name again. Father, Mother, Uncle Daniel. The list still had only 4 people. I turned my head toward the corner of the terminal. My grandfather sat on a metal chair, his legs pressed together like a boy waiting for someone to call his name. I walked to the information desk nearby. The woman behind the counter wore glasses, her silver hair tied neatly in a bun. I gave my grandfather's last name. She typed a few lines on the keyboard, the light from the screen reflecting on her glasses. After a moment, she looked up. "This flight only has 4 passengers from the Bennett family." The woman behind the counter looked back at the screen once more and then added, "Oh, there's one more thing. A vehicle from the nursing home will arrive in 20 minutes. It will pick him up at the service area behind the terminal." When I heard that sentence, my heart felt like it stopped. I turned back toward my family. Everyone looked completely calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. My grandfather was still sitting there, his eyes following the stream of people passing by, the gentle gaze of someone waiting for his family to call him to leave. I had only taken a few steps when my phone vibrated in my pocket. An unknown number. The screen lit up with a short message. "If you see your grandfather at the airport, they've already started the plan." My phone vibrated again with another message. "Don't let them make him sign any papers today." I stared at the phone and a few memories suddenly surfaced in my mind. The message stayed on the screen for a few seconds before the display went dark. I stood there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, as fragments of memory from the past few months suddenly came back, things that once seemed meaningless. In my kitchen, many evenings my father and Uncle Daniel would talk quietly together. Every time I walked in to open the refrigerator for water, they would immediately fall silent. My father's voice would suddenly sound so forced that even he could hear the awkwardness in it. My grandfather had been appearing in the house less and less. Before, even when his memory was confused, he still came downstairs to eat dinner with everyone. He sat at the end of the table, sometimes telling old stories from the days he drove trucks. About 3 months ago, my father moved him to the room at the end of the second-floor hallway. The reason sounded reasonable. He needed quiet to rest. From that moment on, he never appeared at dinner again. A few childhood memories began returning to me. When I was little, every Sunday afternoon, I would run to the garage behind the house. My grandfather was always there. I sat on a chair beside him, listening to him explain every bolt and every wire, even though I understood none of it. I looked toward my father and Uncle Daniel. The two of them were leaning close together, speaking so quietly it was hard to hear. The memory of a transfer document on the kitchen table that night flashed through my mind. Suddenly, I remembered something important I had forgotten before. That night, my grandfather had held the pen for a very long time. He looked at the paper and then asked my father in a slow, trembling voice, "Why am I signing this?" My father quickly said, "Just paperwork to update the house records." My grandfather nodded, the pen shaking in his hand as it nearly touched the paper. But at that moment, I walked into the kitchen to open the refrigerator. My father immediately pulled the paper back and said, "Let's finish it tomorrow. Once he signs the documents, everything will be neat and settled." Uncle Daniel asked something else, but my father shook his head, his voice dry. "Don't drag this out." That was when I walked into the kitchen, and they instantly switched to another topic. I had thought it was just a normal financial discussion. My family talked like that often. But standing in the terminal that morning, those old sentences suddenly fit together like broken pieces of glass. My father and Uncle Daniel had known about this in advance. The trip they called a family trip had never included my grandfather. I stood there among the rushing crowd of the airport, yet it felt as if every sound had been drained away. The most painful betrayal does not come from shouting. It comes from careful plans arranged quietly under your own roof. I looked at the ticket in my mother's hand that had no place for an old man holding a worn radio. In that moment, I realized that family is not always a harbor. Sometimes it is a ship running away, and they are willing to leave the old captain behind simply because he no longer has the strength to steer. I put my phone in my pocket and walked straight toward my father. I asked immediately, "Why doesn't Grandpa have a ticket?" My father turned to look at me, his expression frighteningly calm. He started talking about professional care, but I knew behind those words was a cruel plan. Do you want to know what really happened in that tense conversation? Comment continue, and I'll tell you in the next part. And then he looked at me with a calmness that made my question feel out of place in the noisy crowd. He answered briefly, "He needs to be cared for in a better place." I stood still for a few seconds. If this had really been about taking him to a care facility, my father would have said it clearly from the beginning. He liked everything organized and transparent, especially family matters. But that morning, every answer was cut short. "Where?" I asked. My father looked slightly irritated, as if I were wasting his time. Behind us, the airport announcement sounded again, reminding passengers to prepare for the flight. People began moving toward the security gate. Suitcases rolled across the floor, shoes tapping steadily. Sometimes family becomes strangers in the very moment you are standing beside them. That kind of collapse is not loud. It arrives quietly and surrounds you in the middle of a crowded terminal. I looked back at my grandfather. A middle-aged man passed by, and my grandfather reached out and held his arm, his voice trembling. "Has my family come back yet?" The man awkwardly shook his head and hurried away. My grandfather sat again among the moving crowd, looking around him. He believed that soon everyone would call him to leave together. I looked at my parents, then at the place where my grandfather had been left behind. It was enough. That metal chair would become the place where he waited until airport staff started wondering why an old man had been sitting there for so long. By then, my family's plane would already be in the sky. I stopped in the middle of the walkway, my hand still holding my grandfather's. The sounds around us continued, the rolling suitcases, the flight announcements, blending into a chaotic noise. My grandfather stood beside me, quietly looking around this unfamiliar place. I turned back. My father stood near the security gate, his shoulders stiff. Uncle Daniel stepped forward, his eyes tense. My mother stood behind them, clutching her handbag as if it were the only thing keeping everything from breaking apart. "I'll take him," Uncle Daniel said sharply. "You're going to ruin everything." His voice was loud enough, that several people nearby stopped and looked. A middle-aged man pulling a suitcase slowed down. A young woman turned her head slightly. The air between us grew heavy. My father stepped closer, his voice low but firm. He said this trip had been arranged for a long time, that my grandfather needed to be taken to a place more suitable for his condition. He said it had all been carefully planned, that an elderly man with a failing memory needed professional care, needed a stable and quiet place. The words sounded reasonable. The only problem was that he was saying them in the middle of the airport terminal, just before boarding a plane that had tickets for everyone except my grandfather. I looked at my grandfather, his hand tightened slightly around mine, a natural reflex. My father growled, "Don't make a scene here. Everything is scheduled. The tickets are bought. Don't ruin the plans of the adults." I stood there listening, my eyes passing over each face in my family. My mother avoided my gaze. Uncle Daniel checked his watch and then looked toward the gate as if counting every minute. The entire terminal seemed to pause after Uncle Daniel's words. Everything had been exposed. This was not simply a trip, but a cruel expulsion. My grandfather stood beside me, still holding my hand. My father said the boarding gate would close soon, that everything had been arranged long ago, that once everyone got on the plane, everything would be settled. At that moment, an older woman who had been standing near the row of seats walked toward me. She wore a beige knit coat, her silver hair tied neatly behind her neck. Perhaps she had been there for a while. She looked at me, then at my father and Uncle Daniel. Then she leaned slightly toward me, speaking softly so only the two of us could hear. She said she had been sitting there for almost an hour and had accidentally overheard parts of a conversation between those two men. She said they mentioned some documents, and that once my grandfather signed them, everything would be settled. That sentence made my palms turn cold. The old woman shook her head gently, a trace of sympathy in her eyes. Then she added one more short sentence, lowering her voice until it was almost a breath. "They're waiting for him to sign something." She stepped back after saying it, as if she had just done something she felt might be too intrusive. My phone vibrated again. A new message appeared. I looked down at the screen and froze. The same unknown number had sent another line. "Don't let them take him away from here." I looked up in surprise. The silver-haired woman was still standing a few steps away. She gave a small nod. I stood still for several seconds. The scattered memories from the past months suddenly fit together. The conversation in the kitchen, the room at the end of the hallway where my grandfather had been moved, the mention of documents my father once talked about, and now this hurried trip. My grandfather stood beside me, still holding my hand lightly. He turned and asked quietly in a gentle voice like a child, "Are we leaving soon?" I looked down at the old radio in his hands. The metal surface had worn down with time, but the knob still turned smoothly. An old country song played softly, like a sound drifting from a distant time. Behind us, my father began walking toward us. The distance between us and the exit of the terminal was only a few steps. I tightened my grip on my grandfather's hand. If we stayed here for a few more minutes, they would pull him back into their plan. But if we left right now, at least he wouldn't sign anything while his memory was so confused. I took his hand and walked straight toward the glass doors leading to the parking lot. The moment my father saw that, he shouted, "Rachel, you are kidnapping him!" Immediately, footsteps pounded behind us. I gripped my grandfather's hand and pulled him quickly toward the door while saying, "He's my grandfather," and I kept running. Gradually, the automatic doors opened, and a rush of cold air from the parking lot blew in, making the sweater on his shoulders flutter slightly. The noise of the terminal faded behind us. I brought him to my old car. He sat down slowly in the seat. When the car door closed, the space around us suddenly felt strangely quiet. The distant boarding announcements faded away completely as I drove out of the airport. The highway stretched ahead. The sky brightened as the sun rose above the horizon. And my grandfather sat beside me, occasionally turning to look through the window as if searching for something familiar. I drove for nearly 3 hours, leaving the city and heading deep into a small northern town. Fields stretched along both sides of the road, and low wooden houses appeared sparsely in the distance. That was where Aunt Margaret had lived for many years. Her house sat at the end of a small road with an old maple tree in the yard and a wooden swing hanging under the porch. When the car stopped, the front door opened almost immediately. Aunt Margaret stepped down the porch steps, her silver hair moving lightly in the wind. She saw my grandfather first. She froze for a few seconds, then quickly walked forward. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, as if afraid he might disappear again. My grandfather looked at her, his eyes narrowing, as if trying to piece together an old memory. Then suddenly he smiled faintly. "Margaret." She burst into tears the moment she heard her name. Tears fell onto his shoulder as she nodded again and again. For the first time in months, he had called his sister by the correct name. That moment made the yard in front of the small house fall completely silent. We sat at the kitchen table a little later. I told her everything that had happened at the airport: the flight, the tickets, the argument, and the whisper about documents the strange woman had told me. Aunt Margaret listened for a long time. She stayed quiet until the story ended, then let out a slow breath, as if she had expected it all along. She said my father and Uncle Daniel had visited my grandfather several times in recent months. They had brought documents and talked about selling the old house and the piece of land behind the garage. They said it was a way to reorganize the assets more neatly. But my grandfather had never signed anything. She looked at him, her expression softening. Then she turned to me and told me something I had never heard before. 2 years ago, when his memory first began to weaken, he told her that if one day he became confused, there was only one person he would trust. He had mentioned me. Aunt Margaret and I went through his old papers to understand what was really happening. A low wooden cabinet in the corner of the living room was filled with files, notebooks, and old envelopes that had turned yellow with age. As we sorted them, the picture that had once been only scattered pieces began to become clear. The land behind the old garage, the family house we had lived in for 40 years, another piece of land south of town that my grandfather bought back when he was still a truck driver. Everything was under his name. Sheets marked with pencil notes were tucked among the files. Several incomplete copies of transfer contracts. In the corner were sample signatures, as if someone had already prepared the place where he would sign. Aunt Margaret looked over those papers and placed them on the table. And she said my father and Uncle Daniel had brought similar documents many times, trying to persuade my grandfather to sign. But every time he pushed them away. I opened another small drawer in the wooden cabinet. Inside were a few old notebooks, a pocket watch that had stopped running, and a yellow envelope folded carefully. My name was written on the front, in a familiar handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The writing was slightly shaky, but still clear. The first line made me pause for quite a while. He wrote that if one day his memory became blurred, he might forget many things, but there was one thing he hoped would remain: the belief that I would stand on his side. In the middle of the letter was a short sentence: if one day they try to force him to sign papers, stop them. I folded the letter back very slowly. In the quiet room, the old radio played a familiar melody. My grandfather sat near the window, his eyes half closed as if listening. Sometimes justice begins with very small things: a piece of paper forgotten in a drawer, a handwritten sentence from many years ago. I held the letter and stood still for a few seconds before turning to Aunt Margaret. She looked at me with the kind of eyes that already understood what I was about to do. We prepared to leave when the sky was starting to get dark. The small road leading to Aunt Margaret's house was very quiet. But when my car turned onto the familiar dirt road in front of my grandfather's house, I saw another car parked at the gate. It was my father's car. I recognized it from a distance. When my car stopped, the front door opened. My father stood on the porch steps, Uncle Daniel behind him. and beside them was a man wearing a dark coat holding a briefcase. The yard was silent. My father stepped down from the porch first. His eyes stopped on my grandfather sitting in the car behind me, then turned to me. His face hardened. My father shouted, "Rachel, you just broke the law." Then the man beside him stepped forward and introduced himself as the family's lawyer. He said, "You have taken a person with memory impairment away from where the family arranged for him to be." That sentence made Aunt Margaret step out of the door. She stood beside me, her expression sharpening. My grandfather had stepped out of the car by then. He stood beside it, looking around the yard in confusion, as if trying to understand why everyone had gathered here. My father walked into the living room first. Everyone followed. The wooden table in the middle of the room quickly became the place where the briefcase, papers, and tense looks gathered. The lawyer opened the briefcase and took out several documents. He said the family was trying to arrange my grandfather's assets before his memory condition became worse. He said it needed to be done soon, and preferably with everyone's agreement. My father stood beside him with his arms crossed. Uncle Daniel leaned against the wall, his eyes still watching my every movement. I placed the yellow envelope on the table. The paper made a soft sound when I opened it. The old letter was laid flat on the wooden surface. The familiar trembling handwriting appeared under the light. The room went silent when I began to read. Each line echoed slowly through the small room. He wrote about this house, about the land behind the garage, about how he wanted everything to remain as a part of the family's memory. He wrote that his memory might weaken, but the thing he feared most was that one day those things would be sold when he was no longer clear-minded enough to protect them. I reached the last part. If one day they try to force him to sign papers, stop them. I placed the letter down. The lawyer picked it up and examined it for a long time. He read a few lines again, his eyes passing over the signature at the end of the page. The room remained silent. After a moment, he gave a very small nod. He said the letter had been written and signed when my grandfather was still mentally sound. Under state law, a clear statement like that could be considered evidence of the property owner's personal intent. The sentence fell onto the table like a heavy stone. In that moment, I looked straight into my father's eyes and realized a bitter truth. The biggest barrier between us had never been airplane tickets or miles of distance. It had been calculation. My father stood there defeated not by the law, but because he had forgotten that my grandfather, even with an imperfect memory, had always kept the clearest trust in his family. I did not feel triumphant. I only felt a vast sadness filling my chest. This victory was not about claiming property. It was about picking up the last piece of dignity for an old man nearing the other side of life's slope. My father stood still. For the first time that day, he said nothing more. The room remained silent for a long time after the lawyer placed the letter back on the table. The yellow light above shone on my grandfather's trembling handwriting, as if each old line of ink still held the breath of years past. My father remained quiet. His eyes moved from the letter to my grandfather, then to me. This time he did not argue further. Uncle Daniel said nothing either. He simply picked up the briefcase and closed it, like a gesture ending the conversation. The discussion ended without another word. That night they left Aunt Margaret's house very late. Their car headlights slid past the trees in the yard and disappeared down the dark road toward town. From the living room window, I watched until the last trace of light vanished. After that night, everything changed quickly. My father almost completely cut off contact. The phone calls that had already become rare disappeared entirely. My mother sent a few short messages from time to time, mostly asking about my grandfather's health, but there was still a clear distance in every sentence. The family dinners we once had stopped as well. Aunt Margaret's house became the place where my grandfather lived the final months of his life. In the morning, sunlight often fell across the wooden table beside the window where he liked to sit. Many days he mixed up people's names. Some days he called me by the name of another grandchild from many years ago. But one thing remained unchanged. Whenever an old country song played from the radio, he smiled very softly. That autumn came early. The maple tree in the yard slowly turned a deep red. One quiet morning, I walked into the living room and saw my grandfather still sitting in his usual chair. The radio sat on the table beside him. An old song was playing halfway through, so softly it almost blended into the wind outside the window. He had passed away in that quiet moment. No sound at all, just a very ordinary morning in the small house where he had once lived when he was young. We held a simple funeral at the town church. Many old neighbors came to say goodbye. They shared stories about his long truck routes, about evenings when he repaired radios in the garage. My father came as well. He stood at the back of the church for a long time before the service began. When people stepped forward one by one to place flowers on the coffin, my father also stepped forward. He set the flowers down, his hand pausing as if he wanted to say something. But in the end, he only stood there for a moment and then turned away. Throughout the entire service, he never once looked in my direction. Afterward, we went to the small cemetery behind the church. The autumn wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of dry leaves and damp earth. When everyone gradually left, I remained alone in front of the new gravestone. Some decisions protect what is right, but the cost of them often appears later than we expect. I protected what my grandfather wanted to keep. But a part of my family ended there as well. Sometimes I think about a day in the future, a day when my father might remember that morning at the airport and ask himself whether he understands why I held my grandfather's hand and walked out of that place. My grandfather's radio now sits on my desk. It is old, the metal surface scratched with age, and the knob sometimes makes a faint sound when it turns. But every evening, when the room grows quiet and an old country song plays through the small speaker, I still feel as if he is sitting somewhere nearby, quietly listening with me. Sometimes I remember that morning at the airport. The image is still as clear as if it happened yesterday. I once wondered whether I had done the right thing. That confrontation changed many things. My family is no longer the same. My father still keeps his distance. The crowded dinners we once had remain only in memory. Some cracks in a family cannot be healed even by time. But every time I remember that moment at the airport, I cannot forget my grandfather's trembling hand holding mine, a light, fragile hand that could easily slip away. In that moment, I knew he still recognized me, still knew he had not been left alone. And I understood something very clearly. If that day I had gone with everyone else and left him in that unfamiliar place, then for the rest of my life I would have carried the weight of regret. Justice does not always bring a perfect ending. It does not repair every relationship, and it does not restore what has already broken. But it brings something else, the peace of being able to look at yourself honestly. And for me, that is enough. The story you just heard is a fictional story inspired by real-life situations and human emotions. The content of this video was supported by AI and edited by humans to offer a reflective perspective. The events in the story are not meant to encourage anyone to act the same way. Every family has its own circumstances, and choices in real life are often far more complicated. After everything, the only thought I keep from this story is a very simple one. Sometimes the most important thing in a family is not keeping everything quiet at all costs. Sometimes what matters more is protecting the dignity of someone who spent a lifetime caring for that family. If there is one small message I want to leave with you, it is this: cherish the loved ones who are still beside you. A short phone call, a visit, or simply an evening sitting together listening to an old song, sometimes those are the moments whose real value we only understand later. Before you leave, I truly want to know where you are listening to this story from. Maybe it's a quiet morning in Pennsylvania, a sunny afternoon in California, or a small kitchen in Indiana. Leave a comment and let me know. I always enjoy seeing the places where my stories have reached. If this story made you think about your own family, please hit like and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Your support helps stories like this continue to be told. And if today there is still someone in your family you can call just to ask how they are, that might be the most valuable thing we still have.